But as much pain as companies here are having, no doubt there is larger pain. I think that's part of the negotiation tactic here, is that the trade imbalances are so strong against the U.S. that by nature gives all of the power to us, because others are relying on trade with us much more than we are.
If you have an AI system set up that can call a human when it needs the human input, but do a bunch of the automations that the human would, in a more legacy model, be pushing and directing initially, it just starts for me to paint the picture of, oh, I see how this could actually save a lot of, people power. And
Episode 39 of Market Beats with Mark and Jeff. Jeff, good to be back with you this week, and for the second week in a row, maybe for the first time ever in human history, you and I have been together for two different times in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and two different locations, even, as it were. It's not like we're just hanging out uninterrupted together, but it's fun to be together and in person. I think you maybe noted on our last podcast that eventually we'll get enough technology savvy to be able to show a mic or a camera with both of us together in the same room. We are, but you never know. We tell you.
Yeah, that's the truth. And a little bit of a secret behind the scenes here is that it takes us a good 45 minutes to get set up for the podcast in our antiquated setting. Because new microphone, new place, all that sort of stuff. So it's a little bit tough here, not as plug and play when we're back at our normal stomping grounds.
Yeah, that's right. But it's always fun to be able to be together in person and talk through some of the realities that we're living and seeing, in the market. And interesting, to see some of the anecdotes that are out there in terms of pricing. And I think the theme today, probably a little bit of softness across the board in the markets, for consumers, to just a lot of things going on out there. But fun to have you here. We'll host you in my backyard today. Ironically, we were at the X conference in San Antonio, Texas, your neck of the woods last week. We're both together on the street. So who knows where we'll get back.
Yeah. Where in the world does market moves? It is interesting traveling around the last couple of weeks. It is noticeably different from my perspective from a variety of aspects. The first is just kind of event prices for entertainment. And I think all of this is encompassed by a general softening of what I've seen. I have generally checked out of a lot of dining out, a lot of entertainment, a lot of travel, because the market has just been so hot. And where you might be looking more over the last couple of years, if I'm looking for some sort of an affordable option, whether it be a meal or a hotel for a week or whatever it might be, an airplane ticket, the longer I wait, the worse the scenario gets, the more expensive everything gets. And I have really seen that reverse course here over the last 3-4 weeks, and notably in the last 2. I've seen venue tickets, those sorts of things dropping in price quite a bit. I have seen Airbnbs dropping in price. I spent some time on the Las Vegas Strip yesterday, and boy, I have been just shocked. And of course, me coming from a really horrible position that I've been in, was just as a real estate professional, sort of hoping for some sort of a dip in economic activity, because I believe that that's what we need to get to return to a healthy market, but we won't get there until that happens. And so you go around and you see airports just slamming busy. You see Las Vegas just slamming busy. And how on earth are all these people doing this? And it's a noticeable change, I think, and these prices reflect that, Jeff.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you taking one for the team, Mark, and doing some reconnaissance on the Vegas Strip for us. But I assume what you're saying is down there you weren't seeing things as busy there as what you would have seen in the past. And you and I were happened to be at the appraisal conference in San Antonio last week. It was kind of interesting to just watch pricing, even on the same time they had the Final Four going on, and then the ENCAA men's tournament game that came up, and it was just interesting. We were kind of out of curiosity tracking what are the prices to go to that event, the championship game. And now I'll tell you, We did end up doing it. My wife was thinking about me coming to the conference with me and trying to catch some of the Final Four games. Thought it'd be kind of fun and cool. Maybe you got to be there anyway. We ended up not doing that, but it was just interesting to track even on the day of the championship game. Ticket prices were a fourth of what we were seeing when we were looking 3 months ago. Saying, hey, it'd be kind of cool to go, but man, it's pretty pricey to get tickets for two of us, to go to some of those games. And I just wouldn't be really surprised that the pricing was much less to even get it lower as the got closer to game time and stuff. And I understand, of course, just an anecdote of what we're seeing out there, but between that and Vegas Strip slower, looking at lodging prices getting better instead of worse, as it gets closer to maybe looking. Just not what we've been seeing over the last several years, and it really is kind of painting this picture of a little bit of weakness out there.
Jeff, I think I learned this from my father, and I'm not sure it makes a whole lot of sense. I think he was probably pretty dorky, and I have taken those traits in myself, but he used to watch the shredded tires on the highways and think that was some sign of economic hard times, because truckers couldn't afford to replace their tires and were stretching it a little bit further. But and so as the appraisers that are out there, you're kind of just always watching the economy, whether overtly or not, subconsciously. And I was parked in the parking shuttle or the airport parking lots to take the parking shuttle to the airport, and over the last 2 years, I mean, it's been I have to reserve in advance to get it, 24 hours in advance to make sure that I've got a spot. I've been caught multiple times with it full and not having a lot of options. 59% full this week when I looked. So that's a really noticeable difference. In another observation, I was talking to a firefighter / paramedic in Houston. It was telling me that calls are down. Now is that economy related? I don't know. He told me that in response to some of the thawing out of the housing market that we've seen since January. And so his response, boy, I'll tell you what, we've seen it was 40 or 50% reduction in calls. They're going, I don't know if any of that can be related, but less activity. And I think, Jeff, about M2, which is the velocity of money. It's a metric that measures how much a dollar is changing hands, and it certainly seems on all accounts that is slowing.
Yeah, it definitely squares with what we're observing, kind of firsthand and anecdotally. And of course, you can get the wrong impression only relying on anecdotal information. But I think it all comes together to kind of make sense. I was just talking with a real estate friend earlier today, and kind of observing the same thing, that we're seeing things pick up, but since the first of the year in the real estate market, here locally where we're at, he's just seeing a lot more what he described as buyer hesitancy, with change of administration and with tariff talk, with a lot of things, people who were kind of on the fence pulling back instead of pulling the trigger. There was a little bit of an exception with the dip in some interest rates, but those have quickly bumped back up. And he's saying, people are just now going to wait and see, as opposed to pull the trigger on large-scale purchases, homes and other things like that. And it all kind of come in the same story, that the economy doesn't seem to be as strong as it felt to be prior to the beginning of the year.
That reminds me of a pretty small but acquaintance I have through the social media. I believe his name's John Downs. He's a mortgage broker out of Washington, D.C., and it's been notable to follow. He comments a lot on real estate trends and economics. And I've seen him, all throughout the high interest rate rises. And I don't know if he's a sole proprietor or not, but it kind of gives a feeling for that, and whether you're an appraiser or a real estate agent or a loan officer, you got you got your small bucket of things going on. There are a lot that find the niche that just didn't see a lot of down during these down times. But through the interest rate rise, through this great freeze that we've had, through the beginnings of Doge being in Washington, D.C., and having a bunch of people with layoffs, it's really just not affecting things, all the way through all of those different phenomenon. But now, with the stock market down, this tariff thing is really kind of hacking the confidence that people have in business, in their in retirement, in portfolios, and all of that sort of stuff.
Well, the stock market's adjusted to reflect some of the hesitancy, the concerns about basically profitability of companies across the board if there is this underlying tariff tax that's going to be imposed. And so, the stock market has pulled back and retreated, in part or in large part, I think, related directly to that. And so it's starting to have a little bit of a ripple. I was at a board meeting, and so I was talking with a real estate agent friend. I was talking with a car dealership friend who sells used cars. As a side note, the one thing you'll be interested in this, I haven't indulged it, but he can't keep Teslas used Teslas on his lot that qualify for the tax rebates. Everything else is kind of soft, but the pricing is attractive. You've got the used car like EV tax credit, for $4,000. He said, he blew through like 4 or 5 last week. He's got 7 more on board, or 5 more before they even show up on the lot. So it is really interesting. But Tesla aside, and there's some kind of unique dynamics going on, with that. I think Elon's role with Doge, he was commenting about how it used to be 5 or 6 years ago that you were assigned as somebody who was driving something because it's good for the environment. It's totally been shifted on its head. I mean, his description of it, and he's saying so it's interesting to see his perspective on the type of buyers that they're working with, coming in and picking up cars. But I think the broader point is simply that he saw a bit of a bump as the tariffs were first announced. The activity and transactions in traffic, everybody's getting more expensive. I better buy now. And Tesla aside, everything else, you're seeing things kind of slow down and not be, as quick to move. And so just, another situation where, from that little anecdotal instance of a small, used car dealer, I think through a lot of the economic data you're seeing at the macro level, there's been a bit of a bump in economic activity on knowing that the tariffs are coming, trying to kind of get out ahead of that. I kind of expect to see a bit of maybe a more marked drop off in a lot of volume and activity once people kind of go through that last little spending frenzy before reality sets in. Now, I may be wrong, but I kind of think that may be what we see.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jeff. I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. I think the only thing that maybe starts to bring people out is to have permanent clarity with regards to tariffs. And it does feel like the Trump administration is hell bent on not creating that certainty right now. It was probably a couple of years now ago, but I found myself at a mall needing some business clothes, and I was trying stuff on and nothing fits because I'm oddly shaped and all sorts of things, right? And I was sitting there looking to myself like, why on you kind of consider yourself a bit of a futurist? Why on earth are you still going to a mall and trying all this stuff on? There's got to be a better way. And one of many places that I stumbled on was Cuts. It's like cutsclothing.com or something. If you ever heard of it, they do a good job of advertising. But long divergence there to get to. He just wrote kind of an open Twitter post to President Trump saying, "Look, I've been supporting you all along, and this is going to sink us here pretty shortly." That he's making all of his clothes in China, I guess. And, there were a couple of relief outlets. Even in the first term when this was being done, but those have been shut off intentionally by the administration too. And saying, look, there's me and a lot of really good, hardworking businesses that grown to I represent the American community that are going to die off. I'm thinking in the back of my mind, welcome to real estate appraisal or lending or sales over the last 2 years, and nobody has been coming to our relief. But that is, I don't wish that on anybody. It's been really, really difficult for sure. But these are all signs that and I don't know how the administration reacts to it. I think they would want a solution sooner rather than later, because there is just a lot of pain, Jeff, and I think that's creating some of the problem.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I've heard a couple of Wall Street Journal news articles talking a little bit about this kind of phenomenon going on, where those that initially were supportive of the administration and trying to negotiate favorable trade deals are starting to be hurt by it. And we're just saying, like, how long can this really go before we find ourselves in the crosshairs or in a economic situation that's just not sustainable. Today there was a highlight, I think, on NVIDIA and the concerns around like what do they do as the kind of the tariff tensions rise between U.S. and China, and they've got products to serve, to try to build and serve. They can't just change their operating structure overnight, and it's just one of many. I mean, on a national scale, but just like the clothes dealer that you were talking about, it's you can absorb some short-term pain, but when the government makes changes that drastically change either your cost of doing business or the demand for the product that you're providing, there's only so much you can do to weather that. COVID and the pandemic and lockdown, you certainly saw the dramatic effects that very short-term change of policy had, and from restaurants through across the board. And this is different in a sense, but it's kind of the same effect in economic activity, just really having a chilling effect when the future's unknown, the costs are rising, and it makes it a little bit harder to read. And I don't want to see it suffer, but on the other hand, real estate has been so tough to survive the last couple of years that I'm okay if we get this rate relief and then that results in some real estate transactions that start to pick up. Don't know we're seeing a lot of that yet, and even that's a little bit hard to read. But you see a lot of these industries impacted by just external factors that are not in their control, and trying to figure out how to adapt to life.
Yeah, Jeff, what we see is a lot of kind of false starts in real estate, and I think we've just gone through one with rates kind of dropping to 6.5. I think there's 6.86 or so as we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, and I think we've had another false start. I think we're going to see some stillness, provided this tariff plan is in place here for a while. And right or wrong, I mean, it is way too complex of a process for me to understand. All I can do is sort of armchair keep up on as many opinions and as many pitches as to whether or not the tariffs are good or bad, or the strategy is sound or not. Mm-hmm. But Jeff, I think generally where I come to is that it is a sound, bold strategy. No one can know if it will fully work or not, but as much pain as companies here are having, no doubt there is larger pain. I think that's part of the negotiation tactic here, is that the trade imbalances are so strong against the U.S. that by nature gives all of the power to us, because others are relying on trade with us much more than we are. So I think that puts us in a fairly good position to be renegotiating. And you see all sorts of folks saying, well, okay, yeah, we always could have renegotiated this, but these are all trading partners that are our friends, and we're you don't go to your wife and say, well, I'm stronger. If that is the case, maybe there aren't a lot of husbands stronger than their wives. I'll go to your wife and say, I'm stronger, so we're going to do this because you can't stop me from doing. Well, look, just because you could doesn't mean you do. And there's a lot of the U.S. doing that right now. It makes me and I'm sure most looking at it a little uncomfortable, especially when you don't know how it's going to settle out. We don't need to create enemies that are sitting here, friend. But what I know, Jeff, is that we have been kind of two-party system for quite a while now, where the goal is to really, since before the great financial crisis, who can prop up the economy the best with government stimulus until their term runs out. And then you hand off the baton to the next group of people running, and their task is to use government stimulus to prop up the economy. I think this is a reversal of that. And I think that the propping up with government stimulus stops working at some point. It does come to an end when you run out of other people's money.
Well, and when that happens, there's going to be pain. Like to reset and readjust, it is not going to be an easy and kind of smooth and painless process. When the money train stops, naturally there's going to be casualties along the way, and that sort of thing. And not that you wish that on anybody, but I think it's the only way that happens. Yeah, you do give me an idea for a Market Moves exclusive. I would love to see you tell your wife that you're stronger than her, or further than her, or something, and see how that plays out. I'll need a videographer on that. I'd like to follow you around and see how that works out for you.
I will, I'm sure, be reviewing in my mind how on earth that example came up to me in the middle of this podcast. Of all the examples I could have used, that was definitely the wrong one.
Well, it has a little bit of humorous relief, if nothing else, on a relatively serious topic. But kind of bringing that back around, one of the things that we heard this week was Jerome Powell at the Fed making some comments. Yeah, as they're observing exactly, this thing that we're talking about, tariff pressure, what's that going to do to the economy? Is it going to drive up costs? Yeah, probably. Is that going to have an impact on inflation? They're watching and kind of worried about that. Also worried, might that also drive unemployment up? And what do they do if you have upward pressure on both inflation and unemployment? And Jerome Powell's comment, we're basically like, we don't really want to fight that fight, but if we do, we're going to fight inflation, even if it's at the expense of unemployment to some extent. Now, as we're sitting here today, we're still at unemployment of about 5% or mid 4% range. So I think they've got a little bit of room to give there. If we were historically at a higher unemployment rate, his perspective might be a little bit different. But it's just interesting to see how they're thinking about it at the macro level, because I think they're seeing the same thing that we're talking about and saying, well, if we have to fight it, we're going to have to prioritize, and you're going to be inflation over unemployment.
What a world. Yeah. I see the Trump administration and Trump specifically putting a lot of pressure on Jerome Powell. That makes many uncomfortable, makes me uncomfortable seeing that. I see Bessent generally has been trying to walk a fine line between, it's interesting to note. I saw that he has lunch or breakfast with Jerome Powell every week, which is kind of refreshing to hear. So he's been pretty supportive in certain areas where Trump, he says, has plenty of room to be commenting publicly on what Trump should or should not do. Other areas, I think, as it relates to the interest rates, I think he feels a little bit different. So we'll see. We'll see how this stuff plays out. Well, Jeff, we go from strength in the Verrett household to lack of strength in the housing market. What are we seeing from these new construction builders right now?
I thought you were going to say lack of strength in the Morley household, which are probably all true, although I wouldn't be challenging my wife either. Yeah, that's another interesting topic to see. We previously had highlighted some of the Lennar just data and inputs that were out there. Well, this week we're seeing some information from D.R. Horton, by volume, the biggest home builder out there in the country. And you had shared with me a link on X that it just had some interesting data. It really kind of confirming what we've already been talking about for a while. Weakness in the Sun Belt, much less buyer activity and that sort of thing going on. Interestingly, I had a conversation, actually at dinner while we were at the AXE conference with somebody on the DHI mortgage side, mortgage arm of D.R. Horton builder. And just already high level kind of how a business flowing and that sort of thing. But his comment was, we're continuing to build. We're building, into the inventory, even though we've got like a standing inventory level, which caught my ear a little bit. It was just an interesting conversation, but they're seeing areas around the country that Mark that are just not. The Texas, even some of the Western markets, Arizona, California, showing some of the weakest areas on their sales chart. In fact, they don't have to pull out now that to be ready and not, but overall weakness on the order around 25% and year over year in some of their softest markets, I believe.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I see, and this is the first time in quite some time where there is a contraction in sales for D.R. Horton from the first quarter of this year compared to the last first quarter of last year. So 25% year over year contraction in sales. Not surprising to folks like you and I that are in the business and doing a lot of new construction appraisal work. KB Homes has just said on their quarterly call that this is the most muted start to the home selling season that they've seen in quite some time. Well, yeah, I wanted to check that because it sounded a little dramatic, but was more muted than what we have seen historically. So I guess that's not in history, but that's just on average. It's a little bit softer here. And we've been talking about for a while. Boy, did these builders build into the spring selling season. I think the biggest mistake anyone can make is trying to predict what this market is going to do right now because there is so much volatility. So I think it's caught them a little bit. It's not the end of the world, but I do think that these folks are reporting, same amount or similar amounts, adequate amounts of traffic in their model homes in these subdivisions. So people are still coming out, but they're just on the fence with rates where they are, with all of the uncertainty out there. And I think that probably with the building inventory, you would expect that we're going to see some dip in price.
Yeah. We've already talked about some of the increasing incentives that they're having to employ to move the inventory that they're sitting on. They meaning builders in general. I did find that the numbers I'm looking for, Mark, nationally, DR Horton is down 15%. But in the Southeast, Florida in particular, it's almost 26% that they're down year over year this quarter versus same time last year. Interestingly, as we've been pointing this out a little bit, the North is virtually unchanged from year over year. Prior changes. The other big move was in the Southwest, down 22.7% year over year. So just interesting across the country, it's 15%, but in some of the Sun Belt states, you're between almost 23 and 26% down. And it just kind of caught my ear a little bit that they're still building, even though they've got these increasing inventories and then decreasing number of units still. Well, they won't keep doing that forever, but building bills. I mean, that's what they do to make money and your inventory or keep revenues up. And when you're publicly traded, you've got quarterly earnings call, everything on. And I don't know which is worse, whether reduced revenue or reduced profitability. But my guess is that either one of those becomes a real pain point for them, and it's starting to mount now. It seems.
You bet. So. Yeah, softness all the way through. Unsurprising to us here, but notable that the quarterly earnings reports are coming out now and showing some of what we've been expecting to see out there here on this podcast. Jeff, I was looking at the U.S. debt clock calculator before we got on here. We have almost $360 billion of savings. I feel like we still need to do some digging on the calculations and how that's running, Jeff. But I did notice that Elon was presenting to the Trump cabinet not long, I think sometime this week, and noted $150 billion of savings here in 2026 was the expectation. So quite a bit less, a lot of low hanging fruit. So can they get to $1 trillion? I don't know. I was a little surprised that the number was that low. How on earth we have moved to a place where $150 billion and annual savings low? I don't really know, but that is where I am. It felt a little low. So interesting, and in that same vein, we saw the Pentagon ending $5.1 billion worth of IT consulting contracts. This is including some of our favorite consulting firms, Accenture and Deloitte and the like. With AI, those guys are getting hit in a lot of directions. You see all these SaaS providers that it's obvious that the government was subscribing, 300,000 extra subscriptions by one entity as a rounding error sort of thing that are being fixed here. And I think it's a reasonable question to ask. What some of these monthly recurring revenue numbers are without the government subscriptions in there, and we may find that out sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that headline grabbed my attention as well, and especially since we're recording on the week of tax filing day, and I ended up with the privilege of sending some dollars to the government on the 15th. Yeah, it was doing my civic duty, of course, and it's tricky calculating things if you have moving parts, but to be focused on the efficiency and eliminating the waste, we're just reevaluating what are we doing and why. Makes a lot of sense. I've heard somebody comment or observe that it seems that they've moved the national elections about as far away from the tax filing deadline as you possibly can, like on the calendar, to keep it as far from recent memory as possible. And I've often thought that if you had a vote, right on the heels of paying taxes, you might have a little bit more fiscal discipline imposed just by virtue of politicians having older base, a little bit more sensitive to the tax bills going out. But interesting to see, and I didn't know, you were talking about the projected saving from $1 trillion down to what was it,
150 billion.
Yeah, really. still, I take that out of nothing for
Sure.
sure. Yeah, I might say that to my pocket, but I think it's proving to not be as easy to get to that big number as it needs. But when you're running a $2 trillion deficit, it seems like you need to be aiming for something on that order to really make a meaningful difference or dent in it. But it comes back to exactly what you were saying, Mark, that if the government's spending a whole bunch of money, the economy will good. I don't think that can continue forever without having some real adverse long-term effects. And, do we cut the budget, by a trillion and make that up, or do we cut it by, a tenth of that or something and, make a little bit of a dent, but not nearly as much. You seem to be playing that in real time, but I'm not sure how it ends up, when it's all said and done.
Well, Jeff, and you just throw on top of all of this, the journey towards artificial general intelligence and all of the advances here. I mean, we are really taking it on the chin. And I saw someone, I think, provocatively suggest that we have begun the AGI era here, and a lot of the turmoil that we're seeing is that, and I'm sure in a lot of eras that have begun, that you'd be a month or two into it and not realize that you're in it, maybe 4 or 5 years into it and not realize that you're in it.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, if we're there's in like, what more could we take, or maybe we're taking actions because we're beginning to get into this era, and the voting bloc has that in the back of their minds, and it's causing them to vote things in that they wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really know on the artificial general intelligence. Are we there? How will you know when you're there? I mean, that's been a conversation. It is a topic for years, and it's kind of an interesting one to think about. You and I, even just earlier today, had an interesting conversation with somebody who's in that AI space specifically, and that conversation was refreshing because this individual does a little bit of kind of adjunct teaching at a university, but was saying, he and his team are so much more efficient at programming that it's almost easier to program or code something from scratch than it is to take it off the shelf, like kind of help tool to program. And it's those kinds of efficiencies that I think can really be the productivity gains that we need. And I've heard, for several years, AI is going to lead to, productivity gain. Well, that's great, but we're not really seeing that in a space that we operate in, at least day in, day out activities. But to see where that's actually happening and kind of get a little bit of better or more granular view of what might that actually be, not just for those in the tech and coding space, but for all of us that rely on some sort of software application, and a reimagining of how it can work, and not have to have static coding, but have agents that can be more adaptive to change. I think the whole thing was really fascinating. And we're talking maybe more curriculum than we planned. Maybe it's exactly the amount that we planned, but I'm interested to see how the actual implementation of AI can hold up for everybody who touches uses software just more every day. I'm hoping that silver lining that can be a real benefit for us in the long run.
Jeff, I can vouch for the show notes to say that doom and gloom was not on the show list for today, but it is living rent free in Jeff and I's head these days, and it almost takes physical intention to kind of get yourself out of that. And a little silver lining for the hopeless futurists that are out there. In that conversation we had today, it was suggested that something like 10 to 25 trillion of global GDP is going to be added because of AI in the next 3 years. And this may not have been all of the countries, but this is like adding another Germany, South Korea, Japan, and India to the world stage in the global GDP. And so while and this conversation is partly in the context of programmers, and a lot of folks just throwing their hands up, like I stopped looking for programming jobs because that thing is the lowest of the hanging fruit of artificial intelligence, it seems. But when 10 to 25 trillion of global GDP is going to be created, that isn't all automated AI running. There is going to be an enormous amount of new job and new need for employment. Maybe not all the same way that we've been employed the last 50 years, 100 years, and all that. But I think there is we will find a way to keep people busy. I'm certain of that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And how it evolves is hard to know. Understanding better how it can work and what it can do, and even just the vision cast of, rather than the human being the one that goes out and calls on the technology in terms of like managing a workflow or something, for example. If you have an AI system set up that can call a human when it needs the human input, but do a bunch of the automations that the human would, in a more legacy model, be pushing and directing initially, it just starts for me to paint the picture of, oh, I see how this could actually save a lot of people power. And the thing, he talked about some companies not necessarily having mass layoffs, but just not replacing programmers as they leave or time out or retire or whatever, because of the productivity gains. But you still need the programmer knowing how the programming and coding works to know if these are going right or not. And I think for most of us, that's what the productivity gain is going to be. I don't think that, I hope anyway, but I don't think that an AI system is just going to become the appraiser. But I think an appraiser understanding what an AI system can do for them and at their behalf, on their behalf, to an actual productivity gain. But I hope that to be the case. But it is. So I'm learning more about it. It really is a fascinating world that we're living in now, and then arriving on.
Yeah, just simply amazing. And I think in the same vein, and in switching to what I think is our last show topic, Jeff, is the vertical stack of lending disruption from home search to home buying and home lending, and then refinancing all the way through, and kind of life of loan sort of stuff. And we have Zillow with kind of a bold, I don't know, maybe a little arrogant move. I'm not sure, or maybe it is one in defense. Because they're concerned that they are vowing to not list a property that has been kind of a pocket listing or a private listing to a small subset before it goes to major public listing or release. Zillow is saying, we're not going to list those properties. And so you aren't going to get access to our vast network of viewers. And Red Fin followed up with saying, yeah, us too. And a lot of folks are out there saying, well, is this a defensive move because they need this data or they need this stuff going through them? And Jeff, just to kind of fully set the table here, the last piece, we haven't really talked about homes.com, who is really trying to enter this space, but because they're the newcomer, they started from a different angle. And I think they started with the bet that this realtor commission thing was going to the lawsuit was going to break the way that it ended up breaking. And that, the more the 6% commission thing gets disrupted, the better position they're in. They're much like LoopNet and CoStar. You pay for the listing to get out there, and you can list it for free. Not very much is going to be available when you list it for free, but the more you pay, the more visible the listing is. And it was a freemium business model they described, but they have come out very critical of what Zillow and Redfin are saying here. It's like, so the power to choose how you list your property is not in the seller's hands. It's not in the seller's agent's hands. It's not in. That's where this is landed. It's in a portal. It is totally separate from everybody out there. But it's interesting that they're challenging that space. Competition breeds a healthy market here, and I think we have that. So so a long setup. I don't know if you've got anything to add there, but it's noteworthy what's going on.
Yeah, it really is. And then to see them taking two different sides of the position there, selfishly, as somebody who relies on data to produce, appraisal reports, the more data, the better. And so to have these pocket listings or these private listings that aren't readily discoverable, it does make it harder to have the full picture of what's going on in the market. So on the one hand, there's part of me that says, well, crap, I kind of want access to all of the data. I like the Zillow and Redfin position of, you got to put it out there to everybody. There are reasons that they may not want to. In an offline conversation, you would even make the comment that, is there some risk of maybe not a redlining, but like some sort of a discriminatory offering or something that maybe creeps in here? I'm not seeing or hearing any allegations of that being the case at the moment, but it kind of sets the stage of, I only want to offer this to a very select group of people. How do you define what that select group is? Maybe it's just financial capacity to buy, but maybe it's, there's some other reason that you only want a very limited buyer pool. I don't really, in a traditional marketing setting, and even like a traditional definition of market value, you want as much exposure to as many market participants as possible. So having it exposed broadly seems to make sense, on average. But these two different kind of philosophies are out there is very interesting to me. For at least a couple of reasons. You and I both, both appraise in non-disclosure states, which means the recorder doesn't know the sale price was of a property, and it makes it harder. You have less data; it's harder to know or have as good of a finger on the pulse of what's going on. And so this, could break one way or the other. I don't know if long term this private listing, gains and maintains enough traction or not. Interesting to see the players taking the positions that they do. But yeah, I hit you on that because it was definitely, some news that had come out this week. It was interesting to see how they're positioning themselves.
Jeff, you and I are appraisers, and coming from this, that it's even on the table to make a decision to do this sort of thing when we can't use the word diversified to describe a series of uses in a neighborhood or something. We are under such scrutiny as appraisers, and often unreasonable scrutiny. And then you look over to the neighboring industry profession that you serve, and I don't know. I just, it's surprising that this sort of stuff that I could just kind of put something out on the market and choose who I sell to. I don't know. I'm sure realtors would look at me like I'm ridiculous for thinking that way. And I'm just coming from a very jaded perspective of trying to survive in this appraisal world. And so the last thing I'll say, we haven't talked a lot about homes.com. And for those of you familiar first, from commercial appraisers will certainly tell you that CoStar is sort of a tax that you have to pay to be in a business in most every state if you are a commercial appraiser. No one likes paying that tax. I don't know if anybody likes paying any tax. It's not like you like particularly sending money to the IRS, Jeff. But it's they have built an incredible business and really built it on the strength of protecting their data. I think being vicious in their protection of their data, but they decide. So it's a really well-run business from my perspective, very well run. And they have jumped into the residential space through this homes.com acquisition. They also bought Matterport, which is the kind of home 3D floor plan application. And, if any of you have a pulse or watch the Super Bowl, you'll know that, they spent over $1 billion in a marketing campaign. One of the actors from Schitt's Creek, I don't remember his name, which did, but I don't. But he's the star of the marketing and Super Bowl ads. But they spent a lot of dollars, and they had just announced, I think it was April 7th, so like 10 days ago, that they were sort of reshaping the board for homes.com. They were reevaluating the business line. They're reassessing how quickly they can get to profitability. They didn't say, but the inference could be after we've spent $2.5 billion on all of these things. And what I saw was that quarter over quarter revenue has been fairly flat in what they're doing. So maybe some trouble there. I mean, it seems like everybody that tries to disrupt in the residential space gets taught that residential doesn't seem to want disruption. I don't like that everybody is learning that lesson, but it sure feels that way.
Yeah, it really does. And like you said, they're not the only one that has learned or is learning that lesson the hard way. And, maybe they come out of it, but interesting to see that they're, kind of see the need to position themselves on the other side of the private pocket listing, debate or option, out there. But that's not the only company we've seen, even a little closer to home, others that have spent a lot of money trying to do something in the residential space that, for various reasons just doesn't pan out. And markets are markets. I mean, there are reasons that they operate the way that they do. There are disruptors that come along and disrupt. But for every Uber that comes in and disrupts, taxi or like ride sharing, there are a whole bunch that try something that just don't work out, and you often see nearly as much publicity around the ones that just kind of quietly fall by the wayside. But that's part of the nature of operating in a market. It's a little bit ruthless. It's a little bit cold-blooded and kind of, cutthroat in a sense. And one of the comments that a friend made today when I was with them at this board meeting was, come to the realization that making money is just not that easy. And if it was that easy, everybody would be doing it. And it's simple, but it really does ring true. Disruption, really winning in a market is just not that easy, because if it were, everyone would be doing it. And you just see far more casualties than you do wild successes. I think the big successes are the ones that get a lot of the attention and publicity, and that become household names and that sort of a thing. But we named our podcast in part because it's just market dynamics that's fascinating to us. We're striving to understand, and there's so much, probably a lifelong learning effort to try to really master what happens and why, and all of these different confluence forces within the market. But we'll naively continue to try to figure it out for you.
Yeah, Jeff, I am certain that the smallest of detail getting right, in who knows which detail and how you get it right, but it's that smallest detail that makes an idea or disruptive concept sing. And I think in the residential space generally, people just haven't found that chord yet. I think they're trying. Really smart people are trying, with a lot of money are trying, and we're just not there yet. So maybe the market will be ready sometime down the road here. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we'll keep observing what's going on out there. As we kind of wrap things up, you had made a comment, friend of the pod, I think it was Jim Amron, you just said I just commented to you that, man, it's a lot to try to keep up with just what we're doing. I'm trying to keep enough of a finger on the pulse to have, something interesting to talk about every week. And, many may argue whether we have anything interesting or not that we're talking about, but there's so much to try to keep up with that it's a never ending, but it's kind of a fun journey, to be on. And as we try to piece all of these, puzzle pieces together, it's an effort worth undertaking.
Well, Jeff, those are the interesting times as observed by the two uninteresting guys. Appreciated episode 39 here. Look forward to the next.
We'll be back again. Absolutely. Thanks, Mark.